Hi, my name is Adway Gupta and I'm a fifth year PhD candidate in the Department of Physics at ASU, and I'm really looking forward to sharing with you all the interesting work that I do here. Firstly, I'm a member of the Computational Materials Design Lab, or CMDLab, which is led by Dr. Arunima Singh. And before I get started on the contents of today's talk, I want to give you guys a brief foray into the world of computational materials design. In today's day and age, we use a variety of materials in a wide range of applications. In order to identify if a particular material is suitable in a particular application, we first need to test it in the lab. However, the list of materials that we need to test are not exhaustive. In order to narrow down this list, we need to first simulate these materials using quantum mechanical simulations that we perform on computers. This means that we can predict materials, their stability, their properties, years and even decades in advance before they are actually synthesized in a lab. Also, if we are faced with a novel experiment which shows interesting phenomena, we use the same computational techniques to try and explain these observations. It is a field that combines the areas of physics, chemistry, computational science, and many others in order to predict properties of materials. Like I have mentioned before, computational materials design often deals with problems that have been seen in experiments, and the observations need to be explained theoretically. Today I present to you one such problem. This material that you can see is called molybdenum disulfide, which has the formula MOS2. It falls in a class of materials called transition metal dichalcogenides, where one transition metal, here molybdenum, is sandwiched between two chalcogenide atoms, here sulfur. You can see the structure over here. It's a structure that's extremely interesting to both theoretical and experimental material scientists, and here are the reasons why. Firstly, it's a graphene prototype, which means it has a structure which is identical to graphene and has a hexagonal symmetry. These materials are always interesting and have found applications as solid lubricants because of their weak interlayer bonds. They have also shown promise as catalysts for reactions amongst a variety of other fields. This material has been explored a lot, and scientists have performed a range of experiments on them. This is one such notable recent experiment by Dr. Qinghua Wang and her collaborators. It's detailed in this publication. Let me first shed some light about this experiment. This is the same MOS2 sample, the structure of which we had seen previously, and this is simply a top-down view of the same. As you can see, there's a small height profile right next to the plot because this is an image that is taken directly from a microscope. To be precise, an atomic force microscope or AFM. The height profile indicates that there's a uniform height of around 3 nanometers for which the entire sample, and it indicates that it's a reasonably flat surface. Now, if this material is now exposed to air plasma in a very particular recipe, we see that it subsequently transitions into a structure that looks like this now. There are a couple points of interest in this new image. Firstly, the sample is no longer MOS2 like it was before. This in fact now is MOO3, which is a corresponding oxide of the previous disulfide. The second and more important observation is that this height profile is now not uniform. In fact, you can see there are height profiles that rise up to 16 nanometers in a more or less uniform background. This is something that is very interesting because not only is the sulfide converting to an oxide, but it is generating interesting surface topographies. This process has been defined as plasma-assisted conversion synthesis, or PACS. We are now tasked with trying to explain this puzzling phenomena. The mechanism that we suspect is happening is as follows. On exposure to the air plasma, the top layer of MOS2 converts to the corresponding oxide, which in this case is MOO3. Now, due to the strain between the MoO3 layer and the MoS2 substrate underneath, this oxide layer at the top decouples from the sulfide underneath and forms the surface structures that we've previously seen in the AFM images. These structures are extremely interesting and look as shown in the short video here. These structures are called nano scrolls. It is akin to taking a rectangular piece of paper and rolling it up. These scrolls are interesting due to multiple reasons, the chief of them being that a structure like this will have the same surface area as a flat sheet, but will greatly reduce its effective volume as it's rolled up. This in turn vastly increases the potential range of applications that this material can be used for, simply because it has a much smaller volume while maintaining the same effective surface area. Now that we have assumed a mechanism for this experimental phenomena, let us see what the most obvious questions that emerge are and how we can use computational materials design to answer them. Our first question is, what are the other materials where we can see a similar process? We have seen this phenomena occur for a precursor material, MoS2, where upon exposure to this PAX process, it converts into MoO3 nanoscrolls. However, can this process be replicated for other transition metal dichalcogenides? The second question that we can ask is, what are the properties of these nanoscrolls? By which I mean, what are their exact structure and how can we find it? Finally, we want to ask, can this process be applied to any of the transition metals that we potentially identify? In the rest of the talk, I will detail how we answer these questions. Let us first attempt to answer the first question, which is, what are the other materials where we can see a similar process? In order to do this, we devise a screening method that is shown as a funnel here. This is a multi-tiered screening process, and the different tiers are indicated by the different colors of blue, green, and yellow. In the first blue tier of screening, we want to check for transition metals that do not have any layered oxide. This is because if there already exists known synthesis methods to prepare monolayers of this oxide, the PAX process is not really that useful. In our second green tier of screening, we now take all the materials we get from tier 1 and check if any has a layered transition metal, like MoS2, which can be used as a starter material for the PAX process. Finally, in the yellow tier of screening, we search through known 2D materials databases in order to impose further conditions on the stability of the transition metal dichalcogenide. The output of this final tier gives us a potential list of transition metals that can be used for this PAX process. Based on our screening method, we come up with a list of potential transition metal dichalcogenides that can be used for the PAX process. They are listed here below, along with the corresponding transition metal oxide. The oxide is the one which will eventually form this nanoscroll. The first of these is MoO3 on MoS2, the material on which the PAX process was initially tested. The remaining materials then are B, WO3 on WS2, C, PdO2 on PdS2, D, HFO2 on HFS2, E, 1T GeO2 on GeS2, and finally F, monoclinic GeO2 on GeS2. We have thus answered our first question, which is, what are the potential other materials on which this PAX process can be replicated? We now move on to our second question. Our second question deals with investigating the structure of these scrolls. Before we can decide what is the stable structure, let us first see how we can define the structure of a nanoscroll, as well as identify what are the constituent forces that will affect this final stable structure. Here we have shown the structure of a MoO3 nanoscroll atop an MoS2 substrate. We can see, in order to define a nanoscroll structure, we have three parameters: R0, which is the core radius of the scroll, capital R, which is the outer radius of the scroll, and finally H, which is the interlayer spacing between two adjacent layers of the scroll. There is also a fourth parameter B, which is the length of the scroll that was originally placed on top of the substrate. However, this parameter can be expressed in terms of the previous R0, capital R, and H. As for the forces that act on the scroll, we have the bending energy, shown in blue arrows, which wants to increase the radius of the scroll. We have the interlayer surface energy in orange arrows, which wants to reduce the radius of the scroll. And finally, the layer substrate energy, which determines the feasibility of this oxide placed on top of the corresponding dichalcogenide. We will take a closer look at these forces in the next slide, but these three forces or energies, when summed up together, will give us the total energy of this nanoscroll. Once we know the total energy of the nanoscroll, it is a known physical fact that if the total energy of any structure is minimized, the stability of the same structure is maximized. We then want to find the minimum energy of the scroll structure, which in turn will give us its most stable parameters. Let us now take a closer look at the three energetic contributions to this total energy. They are expressed given in the formulae here. The construction of these formulae isn't as important as the fact that these are defined entirely in terms of the physical parameters of the scroll, which are R0, capital R, and H. Except these three parameters, D, gamma, and gamma SL, which are parameters that will be used to determine these forces and are a property of the material in question. Thus, in order to find the total energy of the scrolls, one needs to first determine these parameters. Our strategy then, in order to determine the stable scroll structure, is as follows. We first need to determine the parameters D, gamma, and gamma SL for the materials that we have selected post the screening process. We then use these parameters to compute the total energy of the structure by varying R0 while keeping the values of the other structural parameters, capital R and H, fixed. The value of R0 for which this energy will be minimized will then give us the stable scroll structure. Before we begin to show how we compute these parameters, let us first get a feeling for them. D, which is defined as the bending stiffness of the material and is used in the determination of the bending energy, basically resists bending and thus wants to increase the radius of the scroll. That is, with increasing values of D, the radius of the scroll is going to increase and the scroll is going to unfurl. On the other hand, gamma, which is defined as the surface energy per unit area, wants to make the scroll more compact and is used in the determination of the interlayer surface energy. Thus, increasing values of gamma will make the scroll more tightly wound and reduce the radius. Let us now move into the calculation of these parameters. D, which is the bending stiffness of the material, is basically the response of any material to bending. If we compare the energy of a flat sheet with that of a deformed sheet as shown in this figure, we can get a measure for what the value of the bending stiffness is. We thus prepare the structures shown for varying deflections, also known as curvatures. This plot then shows us what is the total energy of the curved sheet compared to a flat one for varying curvatures. By a careful fitting of this plot, along with dressing it with some prefactors, we can determine D for our selected materials. We now move on to the determination of gamma. Recall, gamma was the surface energy per unit area. That is, it is a measure of how much the two layers of the scroll want to attract each other. Taking a look at the figure of the scroll here, two adjacent layers of the scroll can be likened to placing multiple monolayers stacked atop each other. We start with a monolayer of this oxide structure and determine its energy. Then we stack multiple monolayers on top of each other and determine its consequent energy. We then take a difference between these two energies, and on normalizing with the surface area of the structure, we can determine the value of gamma. To calculate gamma SL, which is the layer-substrate interaction energy per unit area, we employ a similar strategy. In order to determine this value, we need to find the energy lost or gained when this structure of the oxide placed on the substrate is separated to independent oxide layers and independent dichalcogenide substrates. Again, Taking a difference between the two sides of this equation and normalizing with the surface area, we can determine gamma SL. So far, in the calculation of these parameters like D, gamma, and gamma SL, I've frequently spoken about finding the energy of various structures. For example, in the calculation of D, I spoke about the determination of energies of the deformed structures, whereas in the calculations of gamma and gamma SL, I spoke about computing the monolayer and multilayer energies. However, I haven't spoken about how we determine these energies. These energies are not determined from any model, but from first principles calculations of these structures. In order to do this, we use a remarkably powerful tool called density functional theory, abbreviated as DFT. Before we move further in our discussion, let us briefly talk about how DFT works. Any structure, like shown here for MOO3, is uniquely defined by its arrangement of atoms. This is called the crystal structure of the material. DFT then acts like a machine which takes this crystal structure as an input and, using the laws of quantum mechanics, gives out various properties of the system like energies, forces on the atoms, and their stable structures as the output. We use DFT in order to determine the energies of the systems previously described. We have now calculated the parameters for all the materials that we have selected post the screening process. Let us now review these results and consequently use them to find the stable nanoscroll structures. This bar plot summarizes the values of the bending stiffness for all our selected transition metal oxides. Here, plot A shows the values of gamma for all the selected oxides, while B shows the stable interlayer spacings when they are converted to multilayers that we will also use in our calculations, determined again using DFT. Finally, here are the values of gamma SL for all the selected oxides placed atop their corresponding dichalcogenide. What is interesting is that all these values are positive, which indicates that in all cases it is energetically favorable for the oxide layer to actually decouple from the substrate underneath. We now input these parameters into the formula for the forces that we have seen earlier and compute the total energy across a range of values of the core radius. We do this while keeping the interlayer spacing h and the total length of the oxide sheet placed on the substrate B fixed. Here, the value of B is fixed at 200 nanometers. The value of the core radius for which the total energy reaches a minimum, as shown in these plots, the nanoscroll structure is more stable, and hence these are the equilibrium structures of the scroll. For example, for the system that we have seen since the beginning of MOO3 on MOS2, the stable core radius for a sheet of length 200 nanometers is around 2.3 nanometers. Now that we have theoretically determined the stable structures, let us revisit the original experiment and see how well it matches with those results. Here again is the AFM image of the scrolls from the original experiment. We can see in this region of interest that the length of the sheet that has formed a nanoscroll using the scale indicated is around 200 nanometers. For this corresponding length of the nanosheet, the maximum height of this nanoscroll from the height profile is around 16 nanometers. This means that the diameter of the scrolls formed is 16 nanometers. Now, from our theoretical determination, we have found the core radius is 2.3 nanometers. This implies that for a sheet of a similar length, 200 nanometers, the outer radius is going to be 7.7 nanometers, which corresponds to a diameter of twice that, which is 15.4 nanometers. Our theoretical findings exactly match what was observed in the experiments, and we can thus conclude that we have been successful in determining the parameters of the nanoscroll. We have thus successfully answered our second question, which is what are the stable scroll structures for all our selected materials. However, we are left with answering a final question, which is the formation of the nanoscroll feasible energetically for all the materials we have determined post-screening? This equates to asking the question, can this process be applied to any transition metal dichalcogenide? In order to do this, here we have plotted the variation of A, the number of turns in the scroll, B, the total energy of the scroll, C, the outer radius, and finally D, the core radius with the total length of the oxide sheet placed on the substrate B. For all the selected materials, if we only focus on plot D, we see that the core radius barely varies when the total length of the nano sheet is varied from 200 to 2000 nanometers. Simultaneously, plot B tells us that the total energy keeps reducing as the length keeps increasing. This is an interesting finding because even though increasing the length of the sheet lowers the total energy, in turn increasing the stability of the structure, the core radius barely changes. We then compute the contributions from the various energies to the total energy. We see that the layer substrate energy is the only significant contribution to the total energy, while the bending and interlayer surface energies simply cancel each other out in order to determine the stable scroll structure. That is why even when we increase the length of the nano scroll, the core radius doesn't change. As the layer substrate interaction energy closely follows the total energy, we plot only this energy as a function of the length of the sheet. We have also performed a couple additional calculations where the PAX process is applied on MOSE2 and WSE2 instead of the original MOS2 and WS2 samples. We see that there is a clear distinction in this graph shown by the green and red regions, where in the green region there is enough total energy for this to be a stable structure. However, in the red region, the total energy is not negative enough and the structure isn't stable enough to support nanoscroll formation. We can thus conclude that the only transition metal dichalcogenides within the ones that we have studied that can assist nanoscroll formation are GES2, MOS2, WS2, and HFS2. In conclusion, this is all that we have found. We started with the problem of an interesting phenomena and we wanted to find out more about it. In order to do so, we have first developed a screening process which helps us identify all potential materials that can act as a precursor for the PAX process. We have then identified and calculated all the constituent parameters from first principles to find the total energy of these structures. We have then determined what these stable structures actually are and have compared them to experiments and see that they match perfectly. Finally, we have theorized if this process can be replicated for other transition metal dichalcogenides of interest. All of this greatly contributes to the body of work and all the information people know about preparing these kinds of structures, which can then consequently be used in a variety of applications. I really hope that I've generated some interest in you about the field of computational materials design. It is a fascinating field with far-reaching effects that we can see in our real world, and its shadow is visible in most areas that we see around us. I would like to thank our entire computational materials design group, especially my advisor, Dr. Arunima Singh, for assisting me in the preparation of this talk. I would also like to thank all my funding agencies for allowing me to pursue this research. And in case you want to find out more about our group, please use the link on the screen.